A. Logan, 6140 Pheasant Road, Venice, Florida, phone 813-493-1267, at his home Thursday, March the 2nd, 1989, with Helen Earley of the Oldsmobile History Center. Tape 1 of 2 tapes. Then we'll, you tell us where you worked when you first started, where the employment office was, how you got in, and kind of, if you can think of it, step-by-step chronological setup. But if you can't remember it in sequence, don't worry about that either.
Yeah, and besides, you wouldn't be able to check it out anyway.
No.
Hi, Helen. Okay, I'll tell you. My name is George Logan, and I live in Venice, Florida, at the present time. Started with Oldsmobile rather late in life, by a strange set of circumstances, and I'll go into that sometime with you later. But very fortunately, was able to land with Oldsmobile, what I grew to know and love very much. Anyway, that was in 1963, when I had already attained the age of somewhere in my 40s.
George, where was the employment office when you hired in?
It was, I believe, on the ground floor of building 62.
62,
Is it
okay.
62? Yeah.
Do you remember who you spoke with?
I know Red Cherry was there.
Okay.
But I think Mr. Venice, tall, thin fellow.
Oh, see, Fred Barrett or Matt Campbell?
No, I knew Matt. I knew Matt from the shows we used to sing in minstrel shows.
Mm-hmm.
Matt was a member of our church. Anyway, no, sort of a gentleman, real nice man too. Actually, I can't think of his name, but anyway, he's an old timer like yourself. I mean, I've been with Olsen a long time, and you would know him if I could think of his name. Mm-hmm. A real gentleman. But I had talked to Red Cherry before I made the decision to come to me. Then when I finally did, matter of fact, it was John Powers who called me to tell me that possibly there was a chance for me to get employment there.
Had you filed your application there?
I believe I either did it then or I had not.
Okay, no.
I had not. No, I had not done this before. I had heard from John Powers. I had called. I didn't know anybody. In fact, I was a stranger to all of Michigan. I had been transferred there about 3 years before this. And when it came time, I loved it so much. When it came time to get transferred back, I wouldn't go. And that's the circumstance I found myself in. And I happened to call John because I knew he was in labor relations or something. I asked him if we were any jobs open. And at that particular time, I called him, although it was a time when they were hiring a lot of people. They didn't have anything. First thing that turned them off was the fact that they felt that I was looking for a job starting right at the top, I suppose. And so
what were you looking for? What kind of a job?
Well, at that point, looking for almost anything. I had been a salesman for Microfilling Corporation of America, had been transferred out to Lansing to open a branch, and then to continue across country was our idea and do this all over. But as I said, I fell in love with Lansing on the first day I landed. Couldn't believe that it was so much like where I was born that I was just enthralled with it. And the people were just right from the first day. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of moving or of going someplace where you know absolutely no one. And then find that everybody, it's just as though you'd gone to heaven. Everybody is so kind and good and had continued that way for all the years that I lived there, some 20 years now. And I can never get over the fact that Michigan was so good to me. So it was quite an experience. So anyway, I felt like I was home. And I just didn't feel like I wanted to go back to the east where we came from, and all the traffic and the problems that were out there. And when everything was so great where we lived. And of course, the children that we had brought with us were then used to Michigan, didn't want to go back, hadn't wanted to come in the first place, but didn't want to go back now that they'd been there. And so it was kind of a nice situation. And we gambled and I felt it made out really well. But I had been, as far as the kind of job I was looking for, now I'm a sales manager, right? Well, I didn't expect to be a sales manager. And I had a background, I was a toolmaker in my youth before the war, so, and during the service. So I thought, well, I do have a manufacturing background. There must be a job I can do there. And fortunately, and fortunately, in my apprenticeship, when I had completed my apprenticeship, I had gone on to layout, technical layout, which is handled different in other industries than it is in General Motors. And so I had a real good background in that. And all the qualifications, so I thought, well, they must have something in that. That is real terrific grade, which later on I headed up as a supervisor. Anyway, so make a long story short, they hired me, but on the line. It was the only job open in inspection.
What year was that?
It was in 1963.
In the spring?
No, it was November 13th,
November 13th,
just before John
1963.
Kennedy was killed.
Okay.
Just a week before, I remember, because we had to close the plant down, if you remember, because of that.
Now, who did you work for? You said.
I started to work for Joe Morris and E.L. Bonham. Joe Morris was the assistant superintendent, terrific man. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to keep repeating that about all these people, because I think every single one of them treated me with so much care and respect and one thing and another. I can't believe that we ever got so many good people together. I really can't. And I say that, people think that I'm making it up or something, or have gone elderly or something, but I used to say this all the time when I worked there. It's just an amazing place to work. Every day you feel like you got to go in because you're part of what's going on. It makes you feel like you're part of something. And it's unique. It really is unique. I've kind of made a little mental study of manufacturing and automotive manufacturing particularly. And I think that Oldsmobile is unique in the industry in that they can still run a relatively rough business, not the part you were in. But, you get down on the manufacturing floor or assembly, and it's kind of a dirty business and can be a little bit rough. And yet our people always had time to think of the other person's feelings and things like that. I think it made us really stand out. Something that backs that theory up is I used to deal quite often with the vendors in the jobs that I had. It's another thing. Everything seemed to come my way. After I went to Oldsmobile, I told you about I started on the line. It's only there 2 weeks, and they picked me, put me in the stores, and then put me into the trade that I was qualified for.
What building were you in first when you were on the line?
I believe they called it 75. I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's where later, a few years after this, Jack McKinn's office was, and Kenny Riggs, people like that, if you know, where they built it up a little bit. At that time, it wasn't completely built up like that. It was still the old plant.
How long were you there?
In that plant?
On the line?
2 weeks.
2 weeks, and then you moved
And then they moved me to the receiving stores, which...
Where was that?
Well, that was just off the line. Stores 5, which was at the end of that building.
What did they receive in a Stores 5?
Well, most of the parts that went on the car, with the exception of the things that came
So
from
this
Fisher's
was
Body.
a production store?
Well, we call them quality control receiving stores. I mean, they were under the control of the reliability department.
See. Who was head of reliability at that time?
Well, Elmer Cole was our director. There was somebody above him, and I believe it was Darnton.
Tom Darnton?
Was Tom before he? I know he's mostly in engineering, but I believe he was the head of our department at the time.
Okay.
Not quite sure. Anyway, very quickly moved 6 weeks in the stores receiving, which you do little measurements there. Of course, that was my expertise, but not at that level. I was a little bit higher than that. So anyway, went on from that very quickly to layout inspection. which is the dream of everybody that works hourly there, to be in layout inspection.
Where was layout located then?
That was then in building 19, in a very little corner of the building. You remember when the service department was also in 19? Are you familiar with any of those numbers at
A
all?
little bit.
Okay, and it was a real, certainly not conducive to do the kind of work that we later got to do. In fact, we were supposed to be doing at the time. If you have any idea at all for what that particular department did, it's just absolutely probably the best job was then. In all of Oldsmobile, at that level, there's no better job. It took a little heart searching for me when I had to get promoted to general supervisor from that job. When I was the supervisor of Central and going to get promoted, I had to think it over because it's such an interesting job. You work with everybody, from the Bob Cooks, the Bob Mahoney's, whoever, Doug Craig, they all, and the engineering people, product quality people, had to work closely with all the purchasing people, everyone.
Now, what did you really do, the specifics of the job and layout?
My people, I was a supervisor. Well, okay, first did it myself. You get a part that's going to be used in the car down the road, say next year or the year following, whatever. It's usually done ahead of time, but let's say we're getting close to the start of the new year's model run. And we check the parts as they come in from the vendor to make sure they conform to the print. Well, that's an oversimplification of what we do. But anyway, let's go back, that same model year, let's go back a year or so. We will work with the vendor while he's trying to formulate his dies and things like that to see that the parts will come out. Now, these parts might be the headlight doors, or they might be a nut or a bolt or some part that goes in the dashboard or wherever. Any part to the car, Central had to check it, make out a check sheet, and product quality engineering had to agree with our findings, check it themselves, and then sign this thing to say that yes, purchasing now, you can go ahead and order these parts, but we'll quality control then would monitor. We were in reliability engineering actually, and then quality control would monitor them in these same stores that I spoke about before. See, as the parts come in, then we would check on a sampling basis to see whether that vendor really is holding up to the quality that we had told them. Yeah.
Now, who was your supervisor at that time when you first went in there?
Well, Ray Federer was the superintendent.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Please was then a young general foreman. Tom Please, in the years following that, also became the superintendent there, and of course went on different other jobs. But everywhere that Tom went, in reliability, he generally found me and had me come with him, which was quite a nice feeling.
Mm-hmm. How was he to work with?
Real good. Well, I found him real good. One of the reasons I thought for it was that I was the only one, or one of the few people who would stand up to him and tell him when he was wrong. He appreciated it. He used to feel that he could trust me because I would tell him, hey, Tom, I think we should do this, or maybe we should do this, or I think you're dead wrong. And he'd say, like you told me, if I don't think you're right, I'll still do it by my rule, but tell me more. And he would lay it right on the table and discuss it. He didn't have a whole lot of patience with people who were always agreeing with him because they were afraid of him or whatever reason. This supervisor-employee relationship sometimes makes people think that they have to agree with Bosso, which isn't the best way.
What about Ray Federer to work with?
Ray was a wonderful person. As a matter of fact, I didn't even know Ray. I didn't even know the levels of supervision at the time when I went to Central. And Ray was the boss. And one day, Tom came out to me and he said, Ray, the boss, Ray Federer wants to see you. He's going to say, and I've only been there 10 months from him. And he said, and I really don't know anyone. So he says, Ray wants to see you. He's got something he wants to tell you. He says, now, what are you going to tell you? He says, I don't fully agree with it. He says, I know that down the road we were looking at you for a supervisor, but he wants you to go to school now. And he says, I think, honestly, that it's too early. You don't know the automotive business yet. Here I am, a little kid, if I say 45, but still a young person in the business and not even knowing what was going on. And I nervously went in to see Ray, and Ray told me that there was starting a new class class 13 supervisors school, and that the department had chosen me. Each department chose a person to go up to the quota of 25, I believe they had at the time. And so they had chosen me. In fact, there were a few of us from reliability, people that I hadn't known, of course, up to that point. Anyway, we went, which was a very, very interesting experience.
Where did you go to school?
That was
physically?
in building 20. You know, I don't know if you're aware where, you know where the engine plant is now?
Now, that's in building 20.
Building 28.
Mm-hmm.
Above, I'm not quite sure whether it was directly above 28, because it changed that whole complexion up there. They changed the cafeteria, they made a training center, and of course, at that time, it was nothing like it is today. But I'm pretty sure, and I'm getting confused now, I don't know whether it was in building 62 at the time, or whether it was in 28. However, I believe it was in either 28 or 23, somewhere in that area there.
Okay.
Pretty sure of that.
Do you remember the
quite.
name of your instructor?
Yeah. It was George. He's no longer with Oldsmobile. As a matter of fact, didn't come from Old. They came from, whether they came out of the Institute or not, GMI.
Okay.
But he was a graduate of Notre Dame. He wasn't a graduate of the GMI.
Okay.
George, maybe I'll think of it or so. We
Okay.
got along real good because it was a piece of cake to me.
These were all planks. You didn't have any equipment on.
At that time, we didn't have any women in class at all. That was in 1964.
Did you have any black people?
I think we did. I'm trying to think of the fellow's name.
Was it
Oh, gosh, I should have looked for that picture.
Really?
Picture was a little kid. No. Hopkins. I think Hopkins had already been through school.
I see.
I knew him later on. What did you say his first name?
Wilkie.
Oh, Wilkie, yeah. Wilkie got to be quite a friend of mine, too, in later years.
Okay.
Well, as all of them did. I don't know why I was so popular there, but I think, as far as I was concerned, they were all popular. We got along real well. Wilkie was a good man to work with. We worked with him in the incident a lot. But I digress.
No, that's okay. How long was this course?
Of course, at that time, I believe we started it in November. Now, don't hold me to it. I'm not quite sure. It was November. And I remember we got out on February the 1st because on February the 1st, Joe Morris needed a supervisor. Now, Joe Morris was the original assistant superintendent that I had worked for at Oldsmobile. And in the meantime, before I went to school, I was at Central, and they asked me to go out at the end of a run. I don't know if you know what happens at you people were all shielded from these things that happened down in the assembly plant. And it's as fascinating as it can be. It's the most romantic business. When you are any part of the business where you're manufacturing the parts or getting them ready to go out to sell, which is our business selling cars, if you remember. And each year you have to change. There's a real fascination to that. I mean, if you were building baby carriages and made the same ones every year, I think it'd go out of your mind. You'd know exactly what was coming down the road. With ours, we never knew. With ours, the day that we said we were putting out that new car, many of us didn't know how ready we were. If you were an engineer and I was a reliability person, we each had part of this pie that we're trying to put together. And this puzzle wasn't always perfect the first day. And but there were so many things and so many decisions to make that each day you had something rich in your life, something to do because you knew that you were part of it. You had to be there in order to answer these questions. Oh, if something happened, I'm sure that someone could have filled in for you, but you had it all in your mind. And you had worked with it along the way. Fascinating as can be. It just kept your adrenaline going all the time. And then it wasn't over. The run would start, people would say, oh, the new cars are out, and they go to the showrooms and see the new cars, and as far as some people were concerned, that was it. It wasn't it. Each day, we had to be sure that the parts still made it good. First, if they got there on time, and if they were good when they got there, then the changes and the problems that come in. you buy a new car and you say, oh, this car is not right. And you report it and the report would get back to me somewhere. Some part of that would be my problem probably. And I would have to solve it, or myself in my department, either my boss or my people, somebody would be responsible for that. I don't remember, I used to take this responsibility real seriously. I mean, we were concerned with every customer complaint. Or people sometimes say, "Oh, they don't care. They make good cars. Look at the way they put those cars out." That's not true. I mean, we sweated over all those things. We didn't cry a lot or get discouraged, but we certainly were concerned and did the very best that we could. Because someday we went through the long story of the diesel, which gets my dander up sometimes when I hear people have already solved this problem and all this. And my wife used to caution me on not to be too hard on these people, but they just didn't understand. You see, there are so many ramifications to that, so many reasons that we did what we did and got into the position that we got into. People don't know that because they don't know what you're trying to do and how hard you're working at it. But we had a good working relationship with all our people, with our vendors who worked real close to us. As a matter of fact, one of the things I was going to ask to tell you before, one of the things that proved in a way that we were unique in the auto business or in the manufacturing business was the fact that the vendors, almost without exception, always wanted to come to Oldsmobile. And if you were to see them, as you probably did at some of the Christmas parties and everything, we used to invite them all. They were just like our own people, brothers and so on. And every one of them liked to be doing work with Oldsmobile. They knew we were tougher on our standards than the other divisions. They still like to do business with us. So I had to tell you something. And every one of them, without exception, and you should not say this just to try to be on our side or whatever you want to call it. They used to say it because they really felt it. That they knew that we treated them with respect, even though we expected a little more than you, Chevrolet, or wherever, we're using the same parts. Many of them used to say, gosh, we sell those in your condition all the time. So I realized that, but Oldsmobile don't buy them. And they still like this. So it was kind of a compliment. We felt real good about that. Where were we then? I digress a lot, don't I?
Oh, that's all right. You had started to tell me what you did in the layout.
Okay. And there, of course, we finally, let me tell you, when we started out, when I started working in Building 19, it was kind of dirty. The trucks were going by, these material handling trucks. And if you know anything at all about the technical aspect of checking parts and running a business like that, this all changed too later on. But anyway, we had height gauges then. We used to do it. We were real primitive. Back in 1963, which is not that long ago, things have changed so much since then. And if I were to tell you how we did it then, how they do it now, you just wouldn't believe it.
Someone else on how they're doing it now.
Well, we can tell you that. Because I had the distinct advantage of being a big part of that, building that department and heading it, watching it change into what it is today. Because today I probably wouldn't even be able to run it. But anyway, that's the same as a lot of things that we do in life. Get out of it for a long time. Anyway, in those days, as had been done way back when I was a young fellow in U.S. Steel, I learned my trade, I might say. You have a plate, a steel plate, generally, and a height gauge, and you would measure it very carefully, check in thousandths of an inch. Some of this may be foreign to you. Anyway, you take something and say you want to check how high this was, or how round it was, or whatever, and you would do it with a height gauge and a micrometer, things of that sort. And but because of the fact that you had to be exact, I mean, this had to come out to print within certain limitations, which we call tolerances. And at Central there, where we were first located, first of all, the dust makes a big difference. We had a lot of dust. And then the plate, which was firmly set, but however, in a plant like that, if a truck goes by, talking now about a forklift truck, with material on it, will shake this table. And it will shake, in turn, shake the height gauge. So, you never were sure of what you were getting. It was kind of a hit or miss situation. It wasn't as carefully technical as we would have liked it to have been at the time. Anyway, within a year of the time that I went there, I believe it was around that time, we opened up building 23, which was just above stores 2. I don't know if you're familiar with that end of the building at all. It's where later they had, you might be familiar with what they have there now. They have kind of a vendor. Well, the vendor reps that work out of the liability department, if they still have, changed this a couple of times in recent years, but I believe they still have some people that we call road agents. They go out and see your vendors, and they go out and see your sister divisions that we make parts for each other. We make some for Buick and Chevrolet, and they in turn make things for us and for Cadillac and so on. And they visit those places to, well, keep the quality at the proper standard. And they have a bridge going across now, so you might, and it's within sight of building 64 with Park Liberty. Still not familiar with 23?
Not
No.
too much.
Okay. Anyway, it's on the second floor, building 23. And we just they tore out the guts of that end of the building and made us a real nice layout section. And from there we grew, just got better all the time. They made sure that all these things that I told you about, stability of the tables and the equipment. And of course, about that time, technology was starting to move again in the direction of improving all kinds of things you check with. And we got PDQs, and then we got all upgrades of the PDQ, which was a checking instrument. See, we used to check frames too, which were large things. So I could check, if you took a great big thing that's like a piece of spaghetti and have to put it up on something and check it and make sure that the holes at that end conform to the holes at this end, so that your axles and the wheels are going to be, this is quite an accomplishment. But we used to do those things as well as the little tiny things. See, so all the parts that went on the car.
Including parts made at the factory?
Mm-hmm. Well,
You checked Oldsmobile parts as well as
yes,
vendor
but we used to
made
do those
parts?
a little bit differently.
I
See,
see.
now we used to have kind of satellite, my people all worked at 23 most of the time. Yes, 23. I may be wrong, that's not correct. But if we had some people down in the engine plant, we had people in plant 3, and they would check their own manufactured parts. See, they didn't have to come through Central, but we had the same system, and all the paperwork was eventually put onto the same, well, eventually I think the computer. And that was another thing we started. It wasn't on a computer at that time. See, we would have to work real close with purchasing. So all those people were aware of everybody that worked for me and myself. And the same with product quality. We had to work real closely with them because they were the ones that gave the final approval on the parts. And then we'd work real closely with the vendors. It was just amazing. You got to work with everyone and a part of everything that's going on. Anyway, the building and the surroundings started to improve a great deal. We got it all air conditioned, all enclosed.
How many people were working for you at that time?
At that time, when I was a first level supervisor, I think we had about 16 and 20 layout men. And these are people who had been at Oldsmobile quite a good length of time.
Do you remember about the average of salaries for that position, George?
You mean my own or theirs?
Well, yours and theirs.
Well, because I was on salary, they were on
Right.
hourly.
I see. Well, then what would be
And,
their hourly average and then your salary, if you don't mind?
I mean, so much in recent years, that it probably was a whole lot less than I am going to tell you, because it's hard for your mind to accept the changes. For instance, when I started on the line, I remember that my salary as a first line supervisor was $640 a month. And I think when I left Oldsmobile, it was 20 something, like $2,800 range. So there's that much difference.
Okay.
I know that the last time that I was at Oldsmobile as a consultant, that they were making somewhere in the neighborhood of $16 an hour. But I do believe that when they worked for me way back then in 64, 65, that the rate was more like $4 or $5.
Okay,
But I couldn't,
that's all right.
I just couldn't,
Close.
want anybody to hang their head on
No,
that because
close
I'm
enough.
not quite sure. It's amazing. People don't realize how much things have changed in our lifetime. For instance, I started as a toolmaker, apprentice at 48 cents an hour, which wouldn't buy you too many cups of coffee today.
No,
And today those people make 18 to $20 an hour. So it's kind of hard to accept. Well, you and I can, but probably closer to me. But if you were to tell some young person this, they just wouldn't believe it. Anyway, you're
okay, George, we're in business here.
back in business.
Okay,
So about that point, as I started to tell you, we started to improve most of the things that we were doing there. We improved the level of confidence for the people. Uh, it was just a wonderful experience too, because everybody was in agreement that we were bringing a class of people up, or bringing an endeavor up, some situation that we were working at, and we were doing a better job and striving to do a better job. The people appreciated it because they were getting a whole lot more respect too. Before, everybody realizing, you take a measurement and they say, oh, I don't know, you could get a different one every time you did it. Well, that was kind of true. Now we were getting down to where we were really a skilled trade, the way we advertised ourselves before that. Part of the reason I always felt was that had to do, well, of course, it had to do with people that were our leaders believing in it, and also that I had a little bit of background and knew what we were expecting to do. Hopefully, we could accomplish it. So everybody got together, and it worked out real well. It kept progressing like that through the years. Right from that point on, even after I left it, it used to just keep going. But one of the things that used to make me feel real good was that for years after I left there, they still used to call it my department. And since it was one that I loved so much, it just, built my ego up something. So
you
that,
used the term central. Central,
we call it central inspection.
central inspection.
That's what it was called. And today it's called, it had a real fancy name, just as everything else that progresses. When you are young, you're just a mechanic, and later on you become an engineer, whether you can spell it or not. However, Central today is up in Building 150. It's a tremendous operation. It's just absolutely out of this world. It's a show place, which ours started to become a show place when we had it. We added, in addition to the little checking that we used to do on our plates, and the teardown inspection that we used to do on such things as second and steering columns and so on, every day we used to tear these things apart. And also on transmissions, Buick and automatic. We had people that did that on a daily basis. We expanded under the direction of Tommy Tompkins. Remember Tompkins? He wanted to have a lab. And it seems that Pontiac had a terrific lab. So they sent us out there, myself, Ray Banner, to kind of pick their brains a little bit about it. And they even told us how we would make the presentation to the corporation to get the money to do things like this. But we failed in that part of it. But we did start the lab. The lab started off rather poorly in that we didn't have any money. And Tom didn't choose to go to the corporation for the millions that it would take to do a real proper job.
What would you have done in?
So we tested parts. You see, when I told you about checking parts, checking and testing come under two different little categories. For instance, you can take let's say, let's take the first emission valves, let's say, that used to go on the car, some kind of part of the emission system that was so vital to the car, are now, but at the time nobody knew how they worked at all. They had different dimensions. You could check those all day long, but it would never tell you a thing about how that thing worked or if it did in fact work. So the specifications on the print were yay big. I mean, there may be pages of specifications, like how many whatever it's supposed to output or what it's exactly what it's supposed to do. It's its function, not size-wise or anything, but function-wise. And so there would be, then you'd have to develop some kind of a piece of equipment that you can place this thing in to duplicate what it's supposed to do in the car. Sounds simple, but it's not. It gets very, very hairy because it's very, very difficult to duplicate exactly what's happening. Engine under a hood, exposed to all kinds of heat and everything else, in a little box in a nice, clean, air-conditioned environment. So there's more and more things to it than meets the eye. It's very, very difficult and very, very expensive. And in fact, nobody had gone into that testing field on a lot of those things yet. It was amazing how we started to get into some of these things to find out that people that manufacture, let's say, for instance, bulbs that we might be using, had never run the type of tests that we say we required or have always been required on a specification sheet or print. And go to a place like Pontiac, where they had a real terrific guy who was an Indian. In fact, he even had an Indian name that is an American name. Real brilliant. And he'd show us some of these tests, and he told us this. Westinghouse doesn't even do this. We're doing this, finding out a lot of things that they could have used all through the years. So it's kind of a interesting, exciting type thing. Although lab wasn't exactly my expertise, I was more in the mechanical field, that is the checking of other things under different circumstances, more size-wise than I was specification-wise. But it's something that has progressed there at Oldsmobile, and finally we overcame all the early obstacles and things we had to learn and all of that. A lot of failures. I mean, a lot of things that didn't work out quite the way we would have hoped. We used to draw a great deal on Wendell Olds' group,
Who?
gauge engineers. Wendell Olds?
Oh, yes, yes.
He was the and his people, good people. I worked with them through the years. In fact, they were the ones that called me back as a consultant because I went back as a gauge engineer. So we used to develop all the gauges for the new assembly on the engine system at that time. But they were a good group of people and almost out of their environment, assembly area or manufacturing. So polite, nice, and the things they learned at GMI in a lot of ways didn't prepare them for some of the things they faced there. They weren't treated as well as I thought they should have been because they were all such gentlemen. And you know all the people that came out of there besides the ones that worked for Wendell, but Tom Place came from there. Doug Tracy.
Okay.
Losing some of them. And so many of the people that you know and love. But anyway, these guys were engineers are by nature a little bit laid back from the mainstream. They like to think a little bit longer than the people that are in a hurry to build something. See, an assembly situation is one that, and particularly with the stress of production, certain things have to be done, and sometimes one faction is working against the other because the production people think they have to get them out, and the reliability people think they better be out good, or they shouldn't go out. Well, there is this little thing of trying to get the thing out because the money that the corporation made, because it has to be made on quality. But people who are born and bred in production always feel that if you don't have the thing out there, you'll never make any money. And this little thing. Well, engineers then, particularly the gauge engineers, would be slow to respond sometimes as far as the feeling of the production people. They would expect it. Right now, give me an answer to this. They're going down the line. What do I do? And an engineer generally won't want to make that kind of a commitment that quickly because, after all, it's his decision. If he makes a decision, and he has to live with it. He was he was an assistant superintendent, but he was the head of the gauge group. And we used to all of us in reliability used to lean heavily in each of the departments that I have worked in. That's why they're probably my closest friends because we were together a good deal of the time. Don Moore and Charlie Bryce, who lives down in Charlotte, Charlotte now. Charlie Bryce, who left us many years ago, but was a real good man. Jerry Hay, gosh, I can name loads of them, but every one of them just fine, well-educated, knowledgeable guys.
Now, the gauge department then reported to who? Who was the
Wendell Lowell, but then you see,
report to?
okay, Tom Tompkins had all reliability.
Okay.
Reliability was broken down into quality control and reliability engineering. Well, at that time, Elmer Cole had quality control and Charlie Armitage had reliability engineering.
Okay, and the
Okay,
gauge
Tom
department was under one of them?
On reliability engineering.
Okay.
See, they were reliability engineers. They also had another group besides Wendell's group who used to, well, so the difference that they did a lot of, well, it used to be hard to figure out what they did. In fact, they got a lot of criticism from the assembly and production people because they couldn't figure out when they would be of help to them. But they used to, their function was to evaluate things in the car. Like you may have carburetors and I might have ashtrays and glove box doors or an instrument panel or one thing or another. Well, it was from an engineering standpoint, they would make sure that everything was proper or what would be designed for the next year and so on. Whereas the reliability engineers, the gauge engineers were working right down there with the process most of the time because it was going on right now. Plus, trying to figure out what they were going to do next year when this thing changed just a little bit. Because the gauges had to change along with the process and the parts.
Let me ask you, George, did you, in your area there of quality control, work on something like, suppose there happened to be a problem in a carburetor or would that problem come to your area and you would have to try to get the bugs out of that or see what was causing it?
In the area back to inspection, the central inspection, we call it, we were the ones who would check the parts. And in a lot of ways, we used to try to match the parts with parts they had to go with, the mating parts. For instance, we used to build up a front end of the car with the sheet metal and we'd have the frame up there and people like Bob Cook and all would come up to evaluate the, what do they call it, spaces between the parts and all that.
Now, at that time, Bob Cook's title would have been production manager.
I don't know.
What was his title?
I keep saying Bob Cook because he was the last general manager.
Okay.
But I don't believe he was general manager all of that. In fact, I know he wasn't. I can't think of the other names, but I keep saying Bob. But you know, Bob's a neighbor of ours now up here.
Yes.
Anyway, get back to what we used to do. When they have a problem on the line, you have to picture this. Another first too. The cars going by. We're talking about assembly of cars now to disassociated from the engine plant for a moment. But as these guys are going down the line at the rate of 92 a minute, that's a lot of 92 an hour. So you're only working, car goes by you in less than that. So when those people had a problem, which ones they'd come to would be us. They'd call and say, such and such a part, it just don't fit.
Can you think of any specific incident that?
Oh yeah, let's say on hood latch. When they get all done doing all these things and they go to put the thing down and the thing doesn't latch or it doesn't fit properly, well, they would first go to the stores and find out whether the parts are any good. And the store was located, as I told you before, right near the line.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be their first source of information. But generally speaking, the guy at the store would say, or the people in the store would say, well, according to our last shipment, everything seems to be okay. We kept one sample out and here it is and it seems to be fine. As far as conforming to the print, that doesn't mean it's going to work. So then they'd call us at Central and say, well, these parts are supposed to be okay, but they don't work. Well, then we would send somebody down. Like, for instance, I had two people who I say was who well, I can't remember, Joe Motz or somebody that had worked on that particular part. And
Who had checked it out as
yeah,
far as
well,
the specifications?
what we did was each person has their own area of expertise, as we all are better at something than we are at something else. And so, like, you'd have maybe Joe would work on springs and hood latches and things of that nature, and someone else would work on dies and uh,
Okay,
a little bit finer things and so on. But each of them had their own. We had one guy who was just an absolute expert on electricity, on electrical parts. There was just nobody, even engineering used to come to Gordy Mays and say, do you think we should change the requirements on that? Or how do you think we should? And Gordy, one of the people who worked for me, was a fine gentleman too, now retired too. He would explain to him all the ins and outs. In fact, he'd build him a watch, I mean, he'd go into all the details. But the people in the product quality engineering loved him because they knew if they had a problem, they had a call. And somebody said that one of their electrical quality, the first thing they would do is call Gordy. Say, Gordy, do you remember checking so and such a part from such and such a vendor? And he would explain the whole thing to them. And then they would be able to base their decision based on what Gordy told, which is really an ego trip for a fellow that's doing his job and doing it so well that the people who are charged with the responsibility of designing the thing will come to you and ask you. So it's kind of a real good feeling to have people like that work for you. So anyway, they'd come to us and we would send people down on the line and just try to figure the thing out on a hit or miss type of situation. Check what they may be doing wrong or what might be wrong with our part.
now we're on this hood latch, for instance.
Hood latch or whatever. And or sometimes there'd be something wrong with the frame. They'd be trying to get some part of the car together and they say, those holes don't line up. But what we would do is immediately we find out the ship. Today, I'm talking in terms of 1963, 64, 65. Today, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. It's done a little more properly, and it's just things that we've learned. All of us have contributed somewhat to improving this, but basically, technology has progressed so much that it has done the job for us. This SPC is just absolutely tremendous.
Now, what does SPC stand for?
Statistical Process Control.
Okay.
We'll get into that a little bit later if you're not bored with me by that time.
No.
But that's one of the things today that changed industry so much and makes it so much more fascinating. I think that it didn't stop back when we knew everything and didn't. But anyway, we would try to find out from the recent shipment or from the shipment that this particular frame or whatever part came from, whether there was in fact problems with that shipment, because you can imagine going from our plant to another plant now, going to a vendor's plant, and expecting him to do all these things right all the time too. We know we're all fallible and we're going to make mistakes, and we don't check them 100%. We did, it'd still be things wrong. Believe me, 100% inspection doesn't mean 100% good parts. That's one of the credos of inspection. However, you would check to see whether something had happened in that recent shipment that changed something from what we checked it before. And in that way, of course, that would be an easy out. If we found that, we'd say, hey, we got the problem right now. It didn't always come out that way. Sometimes it turned out that what you had in fact designed just wasn't going to work right. There had to be little changes made.
Now, would these be on parts that Oldsmobile had designed and made themselves sometimes?
Yeah, or that we had said it was okay for a vendor to make. Yeah, in either case, it would be a little bit of each. Could be either one.
Okay.
Yeah. It happens when you have about 5,000 to 10,000 parts going together to make anything. I don't care what it is. You have to be real careful that the way you designed it, first of all, has to be made to that design, and then if the design does actually do what you had wanted it to do, it isn't always true. But sometimes there's little changes that have to be made in order to make it functional. For instance, they used to do, I can't think of what the heck it was, but if you made everything right to a certain size without any kind of tolerances, the averages work out to make this thing work. But if you did them all to the mean dimension, they say the thing wouldn't work. So, I guess like in everything in life, it has to be little leeways here and there, and that's what the tolerances were built in for. Today, when they run things down the line due to this statistical process control, But we'll get into that. That's another subject. I don't want to cloud the waters with that right now because it's an entirely different category of what's going on, and it's so important to all of us, our futures, if we have any. I mean, it is though, to the future of the industry, the future of the United States. And, I mean, it's a real basic, hard need that we have. You'll be interested in that. Pretty sure you're with me. If not, you're at my mercy. You have to listen.
George,
but
suppose you couldn't get a, suppose there was something major wrong with, say, a hood latch. And here are the cars in production, the line's running at 92 an hour. What would you do?
Fill up the yard with
You still go right ahead and build them and pull them off the line?
as far as they could, yeah.
They wouldn't shut the line down.
In some cases they have. In some cases they have. But that's something else that has to be evaluated. See, that's another reason that makes this business so fascinating. That if you and I were down there, it might be our job to decide to do this, whether to run it or whether to stop it. Let me tell you, when that line stops, everybody, including God himself, is informed about it, and they come down on you real hard. I don't care if it's 11 o'clock at night. If that line stops, they get Bob Cook out of bed. I mean, that's how important that is. Stopping the line was almost a cardinal sin. I mean, we go to hell for that.
Mhm.
It's bad. And so that decision wasn't made very lightly. And in fact, it wasn't made very often. But you take, for instance, there were other functions that we couldn't handle. And that's where we got into people like Mr. Wright over in the lab, and Andy Hoover. I don't know if you know any of these people or not. Don't you really?
No, but I've heard the names.
They were great people
So
too.
who was the, Mr. Wright's first name was?
Harold Wright.
Harold Wright and
Yeah.
Andy Hoover.
Andy Hoover, who was a personal friend of mine.
They were over in the lab.
And they had the real lab. Now, this had nothing to do with
The quality
they were.
lab.
No, it was called. I can't tell you what.
Okay.
Well, metallurgical lab.
Metallurgical.
Yeah, they had nothing to do with inspection, except the services. We used to bring parts over there, and they would tell us whether it had the proper mix of metals and so on.
Okay.
Now, for instance, there might be an arm in the car, like a cast iron pinion of some kind that can't give you a specific, but let's say it's a part that they tested, and that all we could do is dimensionally say that it was okay. Okay, let's say we've got cars coming down the line, and they get a couple out there testing them, and they find out this thing breaks. There's a flaw in the metal. Well, there isn't anything we can do about it. They're dimensionally okay, and breaking would have nothing. Basically, would have nothing to do with dimensions. It could, but I mean, in this case, let's say it doesn't, and it's definitely a flaw in the material. Well, they have on every part that's made, cast, they have a code on it, so that you know exactly how many of these were in a lot that were made. Because generally, when a part like that, let's say it's cast iron or some other conglomeration of metals, excuse me, when there's a flaw in one, there will be a flaw in that whole group that were made in that pot. They melt the stuff down and they add and subtract certain things. And if you come up with one, there's a good chance that most of the others in that group will be like that, could possibly fall privy to that problem. So you go out, and I can remember they get everybody in a case like that. I can remember going out to some of those lots in the wintertime and looking for some of these knuckles or arms or something under the car to find this little code. It might be, say, A12 or something, and that would indicate a lot number or some group that they were made in at some plant in Ohio or someplace. And you have to find these things because they will break, or there's a very, very good chance that they would. A good number of them would, and if not now, down the road. See, it would take the stress.
So would those parts would have to come off the car
They have to
before
come
it
off the
ever
car.
left the plant?
And it would be the same thing as the hood latch. I brought that up because hood latch is real important. People get so used to everything being so good. I mean, we've got millions of cars. And I'm sure in your experience, you've never heard anybody complain about a hood latch.
No.
But I know, I've seen this happen to friends of mine Like for instance, Tony Stoner going down the road from Jackson one night to Lansing after a barbershop quartet meeting, and late at night, and because he had a company car, and the hood flew open. Well, I don't know if you've ever experienced driving along and then suddenly become blind. It's pretty dangerous, and so hood lights can be fatal. I mean,
Could be.
a
You or someone
life-threatening
else.
thing. See, and yet I'll bet you hardly anybody's had any trouble with it. Well, it's because we realize it is so important. We do put so much extra effort into it, and there is a safety factor built into it. There's a safety latch. After you release your hood, you can't lift your hood up. It catches on to another catch that you have to manually push with your finger when you open your hood to check your oil. So, fortunately, it's not something that happens all the time. But in the event that there is something wrong with it, they have to be fixed before they leave the plant. You can't take a chance on it. We've even had trouble with, I remember one of my experience where we had trouble with, stayed up all night long trying to figure out what to do with jacks. Now, you know how often you use a jack. And Don Downey was on boss then. He had taken over for, I don't know, it was Elmer. No, I guess for Charlie. Charlie. Or were they? I don't know. That's a little cloudy there, what Don Downey. But anyway, he was our boss at the time. And all of us spent all night calling the vendor down in whatever state he was in and trying to figure out what was wrong with this or how it was going to be corrected so that we could still build cars because we couldn't ship cars without them. Now,
What was the matter with the jack?
they didn't latch properly. It started to go up and you could slip. And I mean, that's as much as I remember about it, truthfully. But here's something that wasn't going to be life-threatening until maybe down the road if you had a problem. I mean, we could conceivably build the cars and say to the dealers, we'll send you the jacks when they come improved or whatever, but you can't take a chance on that, see? You can't take a chance that you're going to be the one to forget that a year from now somebody's going to take one of those jacks, or 2 years from now, and finally have a problem and nobody knew anything about it, because by that time it would be fade into obscurity of some kind or whatever. So the problem had to be attacked then, that night, the whole night. I mean, we didn't get any sleep or anything, and a jack doesn't seem to be the most important part of the car. But that's the way those things were handled. And even at that, the biggest boss that we had at the time, the supervisor in my department, was there with us.
Who was he?
Was Don Downing, who was trying to figure out how it happened, how it can be corrected, who should we send down there. Purchasing was with us too, because they were responsible for ordering them and knowing how many we had to have. And so what they finally did was sent down. I don't know if you know John. You don't know these people I'm talking about.
The names are familiar, but I didn't.
It's kind of strange because most of them have been around. John also is a GMI graduate and also very intelligent young man. Not a young man anymore, either. But he went down there. In this particular case, I remember he was young then, and stayed down there until they were able to correct the problem and can get their production out. See, which is also an important factor, because then you see what happens. We then have to answer to other people. We don't just say, hey, it's bad, do something about it. We have to be involved to the point that what's wrong with it? Are we sure that this is wrong with it? How can it be corrected if we can, in fact, give them that information? Can we help in any way? Oldsmobile was very, very helpful to some of their vendors. We've had people that were making parts for us, and we would supply them with engineering expertise, help from our people, people to sort sometimes when things weren't going just right, help with their facilities in some cases where we were really stuck. The issue of the diesel engine, which is part of our dark history, perhaps in some people's minds, not in mine. We used to help people make us camshafts. There was nobody in the world that could make the camshaft that we needed for that engine. And we would go out and I don't know how much of this is known, public knowledge, but help them with their facilities and help them with their materials, builds, about a night. get too deeply into that because that's not my field, but we actually got into the nitty gritty to make sure that what we were doing is right and that we would have a part to build the car with, or the engine, whatever it might be. So you see, there was always something to keep your adrenaline flowing. You go home at night and you're almost to the point where you couldn't wait for the next morning. Now, there were other things we like to do. We used to sing in the choir and do things like that. But you always felt that, boy, tomorrow at 7:30, I'll be get back there and it maybe even be another problem. And they weren't such things that people were going to hang you for. They weren't trying to look for scapegoats or anything like that. So it was people working together. You hoped that everything was right, but you knew in your heart that with 10,000 parts, there'll be a problem. And you'd be called upon, which is kind of an ego trip. I don't know how interesting the other jobs are, but I would say that when somebody needs you, I don't care what it is you're doing. Somebody needs you, and you can sometimes supply the answer, at least on a fairly decent average. It's got to be an uplift. You know, it just makes you feel like you're. Well, that's the way Oldsmobile would do with people. Make you feel like you're important. I don't mean important to the pompous or anything like that. I mean a vital part of the organization. Heck, they don't even know you. They don't really know what your background is, and still they depend on you and make you feel like, yes, when you say something, we listen because you could come up with something that's equally as important as the guy sitting next to you. So I always felt that I got the greatest square shake than I could have expected anyway from the treatment that I got.
How was Tom Tompkins to work with?
Tom was pretty quiet, and of all the people, I told you how close we got to everybody. You never really got close to Tom. And of course, I think part of that was because he had talked about Tom Tompkins,
Yes.
and I and I, you know, you try to evaluate everybody just in a nice way. I don't mean to try to put them at any certain, peg them at any certain spot. But each person operates within the framework of due to their own personality. Just the personality has a lot to do with the way they react to people and situations. And Tom was, I'm sure, he had to be a real intelligent man and all that, but he wasn't really outgoing. On the other hand, his right-hand man, who was Dale Redburn, was completely the opposite. He might have lacked in something else, but he certainly was the most outgoing person that he had. And the two of them worked real well together. Whatever the other connections there might have been there, I'm not privy to that. But Dale was kind of the front man. He liked to talk. Dale was a lot like me. He just likes to talk and had definite ideas about things. Not always right. Mine are not always right. But he liked that, and he also was somebody that was like that because he liked me. He used to feel that I was supposed to go up in his hierarchy, which was kind of nice to have one of your bosses feel that way about you. But generally, most people there were that way. Everybody was not there was not much backbiting or fighting for niches and position and things like that. I found it free of that, or relatively free of it, so that hadn't be your major concern when you were doing your job, worrying about who was trying to get your job or cut you down before someone else or anything like that. It wasn't any of that I ever noticed very much. Somebody could disagree with that, but I have found it relatively free of those kinds of pressures. Now, and like I say with Tom Tompkins, he just didn't say very much. And it really wasn't his place to be talking to people at my level on every subject. But the difference between he and a fellow like, say, Bob Ross, you know, or Mooney, even Mooney, whose disposition and everything was different, and his approach to problems entirely different than both Ross and Tompkins. But at least he talked to you. I mean, very often he would talk to you very sharply about something that had to be done, but his pressures were such. Well, I think what killed him was the pressures that he had on his job and his intense desire to do it the way he felt had to be done. I don't know whether that's everybody's assessment, but I thought that Bob was tough, but he was good, and he believed in what he was doing. It was the most important job there, and it was. What do they call those? Production manager? No, it was job right under the general manager. Which
He was
Moody's
production
job.
manager,
Is that what
wasn't
you
he?
call him? I thought that the job that Jack McGinn had was production manager, just
Oh.
below that. But anyway, whatever. He was the second man under a general manager, and that's a tough position to be in.
And you knew,
Eventually, all the problems come to him.
you knew Mr. Rollis too then?
Oh, well,
What kind of a man was he work with?
he was just a sweetheart. He was kind of a guy, and I was early on the line, just a young man, young as far as working at Oldsmobile. And this old gentleman, who probably was my age, but anyway, seemed to me like, come down the line, which he used to do. He used to check how things were going in the plant.
No, this would be Rollis.
And this applies also to Elmer Cole. And he's
Elmer Cole.
to Elmer Cole, who was also another gentleman. And here's a guy, a dirty guy working on the line, and you say, hello, Mr. Rollis, or whatever. And he'd say, no, Bob. Call me Bob. And he met, he just was that kind of person. Elmer was that way too. Elmer's a person with all heart. I don't know how well you know Elmer.
Yes,
He's also a real, he could be tough. As Charlie could be too, Armitage. But they were good people. And when they were tough, it was because they jumped all over that. This is something that you have to do. But I never took it as a personal affront or anything to make it. Did something like that, because I knew if I was in that position, I'd have to do the same thing. But they were good people to work with. But again, the only reason that you couldn't say that when you say how was Tom Tompkins to work with, you can't say a whole lot about it because you didn't have the opportunity to talk to him so much. He was at a staff level, and he was the kind of a person who didn't just talk to everybody. He didn't have the time, possibly, to just chew the fat with anybody and everybody. So, where some of these other guys did do that. Try to think of the name of the gentleman who was followed some of these guys later on and has been in the engine plant the last couple of years with Bill Sutton. And he was another gentleman. Gosh, I can't think of his name. But another great person.
George, let me ask you now, to get back to these jacks, say these jacks weren't working right. Did you send cars out without jacks?
Oh, yeah.
Then later ship jacks?
Well, you have to remember that the distribution system, particularly in the beginning of the run, well, you remember, in fact, you probably still see it. Excuse me, they fill up every lot in Lansing with cars. So the cars, and there also is a tracking system that no car gets lost. And on that computer will have all the information. And if there is a jack missing, whatever, that car will be found. They'll know exactly where that car is. So there isn't any problem as far as building the car in that particular instance, except that it's embarrassing to the people who are responsible for jacks, let's say, or sure there's a guy who's a jack expert. And each of the things down the line, a guy who has to take in the shipment, the guy who's got to buy them, purchasing. Each person has got a responsibility in it that they feel part of this problem. So in that sense, they don't like to see too many cars get away, get too far up. But there isn't much chance, because the chances increase as whatever you do in great numbers, chances for error are greater, actually. So the more cars you build and the more you put out, there'll be more chance that there's going to be one out there without a jack or one with a band jack.
Well, what about recalls? Now, did you get involved in recalls?
Well, the recalls basically came later after I was out of that part of the business.
Okay.
We used to basically have a little bit of recalls, but The recalls wouldn't been in my domain at all.
Okay.
Now, they might question the part that was responsible for the recall.
Mhm.
And in that sense, I might have to go into something like that. But I don't recall being totally involved in any recalls until when we got down the engine, when I got to be general supervisor of the engine plant.
Now, when was that about? Remember what year?
Let's see if I can. It was about 70, 75. Because I was in plant 3 up through the Arab embargo when we had the oil situation. And then from there, with the engine plant, I was there about 5 years and I retired in 80. So I'd say in 18, around 75. And when something goes wrong with an engine at that time, because in the engine plant, as you do in any of the other plants, but let's talk about the engine plant. You get your departments, where you fellows were, 70 or whatever, you get customer complaints. And they would be sorted out. For instance, as it pertained to the engine would come to us at the engine plant, and we're directly responsible for those. I mean, we'd go to a meeting on a monthly basis, maybe at the start of a model year, the start of a new type engine. We have not had the experience with it, may have more problems in the beginning, which is normal. We would have meetings more often than once a month. But let's say we're having a meeting and we have so many customer complaints, and they'll say, okay, Helen, these pertain to you. There's 21 of these, and they come from such and such and such in the country. 18 of these are also your responsibility. Before we get done today, we want some answers on this. And you look this over, of course, you've got your paperwork too. You know what's has taken place in the plant, you know, previous experience on those particular numbers or items, and whether they're better or worse than the last one. And you know, a lot of things that you already know, you prepare yourself for. If that was the big item last month, you might have done a lot of work on that particular one and researched it well. And maybe that one has gone away. Maybe it's something that you were able to handle. But in the event that it caused the recall, they want answers. Particularly answers that it isn't going to happen again. What have we done to prevent this from happening again is really what they're not looking for you to say, how come we have 1,000 of them out there? What are you going to do about that? I mean, personally, you know, and they're not asking you that question. They're saying to you, yeah, we want to know what happened. We want to make sure that it don't happen again. How do we prevent this? What have we done? How much better are we running that operation now than we did before? When we found that it was a reason for the failure here or for a laxity of inspection, whatever, did we increase the manpower, slow the speed? What did we do? We want definite answers. And then those answers, of course, go on. Every one of those things has got a place for responses. And which also gets you into you almost can't talk about these things without getting into this SPC, this new system of operation. Because at those meetings, we used to have scrap meetings every month. Same thing as that particular one I was telling you about. They're a little bit different, but the same group used to meet as far as scrap goes. Production was responsible for putting out the material we're supposed to be, checking the quality of it, and so on. And in the final analysis, we would wind up with, say, X number of dollars of scrap. I mean, these dollars were high. We're talking in terms of maybe millions of dollars a month or millions of dollars in some period of time. I mean, lots of money. We're not talking penny ante stuff. And so there's a terrific expense to run a business. And particularly in the area of scrap where you don't get anything for it. I mean, that's a complete waste. That's something that's down the drain. There's a loss in every matter. Labor loss, material loss, and it's just nobody makes anything on that. Today, and even at that point, we had tolerances. We know that they have to be between such and such and such and such a thing today. And here we were running, being able to sell everything we could build, and running with old equipment, and so on and so forth. Corporation made a decision finally, and this is right around the time that I retired, because most of the changes have occurred from 1980 on. In fact, so many changes that you would just be amazed to know the difference between 1980 1988 or 89, where we are today, uh, compared to any other period of like years. Uh, the process has completely changed. I often tell my wife that anybody who has retired when I did in 1980 and did the same things that I did, had involved the same things in the plant as I did, uh, and if he tells you, he starts to talk to you about how much he knows about running a plant of that nature, either an engine plant or something or whatever, he really doesn't know what he's talking about unless he's been back there, which I've been fortunate enough to do. You listen to this guy and you feel sorry for him. You think, this guy must be an old guy and he's your age, say. But he's thinking in terms of 20 and 30 years back, which things had not changed in all those years up to 80. And for 30 years, they had remained the same. In fact, the equipment we were using was made back then. It was 30 years old or more, believe it or not. Some of from previous wars and so on. So today, SPC, Statistical Process Control, has changed the concept of running the business, any business, not necessarily tied to our business, but any manufacturing business, or even, they say it even worse than banks. So anyway, what happens is instead of having the regular tolerances that we have, now we still have the print is drawn up and it has a regular tolerances, just as we've always known. But when you run into SPC, you have control limits. In addition to those, you go down from the limit. You understand what I'm saying when we say a tolerance of, say, plus or minus 3 thousandths? Well, then you get into SPC and you say the control limits are not plus or minus 3, they're plus or minus 1.5, possibly. There may be increments of not thousands either, there may be millions. I mean, now they go down into the real nitty-gritty, they get real close. In order to do that, in order to make a plan like that work, of course, now this is going to be a real oversimplification. I mean, you're not going to learn SPC in 15 minutes. Anyway, in order for these things to work, you had to first analyze what you were doing. So you say, well, I'm running this with 30-year-old equipment. Can I really make this stuff work? Is the machinery capable first? Because the machinery's got to be capable. So they get the capability of the equipment, and they find out that, hey, even the floors we work on aren't conducive to running something like this. So they scrapped it. I don't know if you were aware of the things we did down there. We ripped out the guts of all those buildings.
Now, which buildings were those?
Well, in the case of engine plant, new engines, it was 28. But the whole assembly plant came down. Took bulldozers through that thing.
And that was in building.
Well, it used to be 75. I don't know whether they still call those numbers or not. But they changed that completely. And then, of course, we built a new one where we were going to build our Calais and what I guess they call one the North Plant and one the South Plant today. I don't know because I had a son-in-law work there. And he used to mention the North Plant. I didn't know what he was talking about. However, in order to get into this SPC, which will eventually turn around things, and it's unfortunate that we, personal observation, I haven't progressed the way I would hope that General Motors would have. We let Ford and Chrysler get a little bit ahead of us. However, we're working on it, and it's a tremendous job for an operation like General Motors. You know, General Motors, they often have to liken it to the federal government. It's so big, in some cases unwieldy. You can't do the things you'd like to do. If you were running a one-man family type business, you can say, hey, we're going to do this tomorrow, we're going to do this. It doesn't quite run that way at General Motors. Even if Oldsmobile was an entity by itself, you might be able to handle things like that on a more expedient basis. But you can't do it when you're dealing in the numbers, size, and so on that General Motors has to do with. Same with the government. We can't straighten things out because we can't get to everybody on the same level long enough to talk to them and get everybody to understand, or enough people to agree, or whatever. So it's difficult, and they have worked on it. It's disappointing to someone that's as interested in it as I am, but I haven't given up. We'll make it. But it's something that if anyone ever questions you about it, it's a thing that turned Japan around, made Japan the great competitor of ours that she is today. And when Dr. Deming, who thought this thing up, or Fawcett's called the father of SPC, first offered it to us back when you first came to Orville right around the war, we were too good for him. We were selling everything we could build. So he told me, we didn't have time to perfect our methods. So he said, so long, we went to Japan, and today he's revered as a saint in Japan. If you do something good, you get a Deming Award. And they bow to him. He's a man in his 80s, and he's still as vital and as vibrant as a person 30 or 40 years his junior. So, and very, very smart statistician. Anyway, he teaches this, writes about it, and charges quite a good buck. Well, finally, after all these years go by, and we've are faced with the situation of matching the quality of some of our competitors, which possibly, I like to make a flat statement on that because I disagree with many of the opinions that are out there. But anyway, we had to bring our quality up. Everybody did. And finally decided that the only way was to get Dr. Deming involved, eat a little crow and beg him to come back. So he did, in fact, come. In fact, I think he went to Chrysler first. You see, all of us, the big three, were all privy to the same ignorance, you might say, or blindness to the truth, or whatever it happened to be. And so anyway, Chrysler started and did a good job on it, and so did Ford. In fact, Ford is doing a real terrific job on it. And then we also got in line, and I don't know the timing in between when we all took it up. But anyway, at Oldsmobile at that time, you, I believe, were still there. When did you leave?
87.
87? Oh, well, then, because you were involved in this, and everybody had to go to school, from the general manager down to the sweeper. And we bought the schools in Lansing, and my son-in-law did a lot of the teaching, and all of us were involved a great deal. Even those of us who had retired and come back used to go to school. And they'd send people to Dr. Deming's seminars where it cost you $800. Some in Windsor, Canada, and some places in Detroit. But he would charge as much as $8 a person. And Oldsmobile would send maybe 200 or 300 people. Plus the living out and everything else that it cost. It was a very, very expensive expedition. For just a few days. Just a couple of days. But then, of course, it used to constantly be taught at Oldsmobile. And we have installations now. That was another very gratifying thing. This SPC involves people as well as product. So what he tries to teach is that your company would be nothing without these people. So give them a little respect. And so what they do is they involve the people in the operation. And where it used to be, you were the boss and some guy would say, hey, George, I think, you're only the alley guy, forget it. What can you know, right? Although he's the person that does it every day, you would expect that he would know more about it. Now, the Japanese do this. They have these quality circles, which you've probably heard about, read in the paper or something. And they do this on a regular basis. Of course, their mindset, their background, everything is different. Japanese are that way. They will listen, be polite, and try to change if they're wrong, admit that they're wrong and change. Where we're kind of brash and outgoing Americans and spoiled and a whole bunch of things, and we believe we know it all. So it was kind of a disadvantage. But today they involve the working person, the person who actually is on the job. And we found through that process, some of these people that work for us that we never thought they were anything but just a line person, even though that's not the worst job in the world, but still, didn't give them the respect that they deserved, nor credit for being more intelligent than they were. They do the same thing all the time, and we think, well, he can always do that, and he can always do that, and we'll find somebody to do that. Well, today, they ask those people, and they sit down with them, and they'll come up with ideas, and we found so many of those people with intelligence way beyond what we ever gave them credit for. It's a really good feeling to think that some of the people that work for you can do all those same things that you used to take on yourself because you thought nobody else could do them or just didn't think they had it. And some of those people today are teachers in some of these schools in Lansing that we took over, and in this same course of SPC that we try to teach. And I know so many of them that feel so good about having been able to do something different and upgrade themselves and to be noticeable. They always knew they could probably, but we didn't. And we being the supervisors and didn't work hard enough at it to, because maybe the vehicle wasn't there. I don't know. Maybe we weren't all at fault, but to some extent we were. But those people today, I mean, it makes you real happy when you go back and you see this young fellow, no longer young, but who you knew as a young person or a young girl who today is an engineer and come up to you and say, this gal engineer a couple of years ago on the fact that if it hadn't been for you, I wouldn't have this job today. I said, I don't think that's entirely true. You know, you have the expertise and the education, and you did it on your own. She says, yeah, but no one would listen before, and you would always listen as well. I appreciate that. I think that's a real compliment, but I know, you have to do it on your own. I'm sure that's the way you did it. But they appreciate whatever little bit you could do for them. But it's so nice to see some of these young people getting better jobs and knowing that they're helping more and they feel so good about themselves. So it's a good program. But
Let's get back to the scrap you mentioned when they tore off the.
so let me.
Line and-
That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. That's what I started to tell you, but I get to talking so much I forget what I'm talking. You've noticed. Anyway, we'd have these scrap meetings and they would amount to many dollars. Today, and one of the reasons for it was that, as we mentioned before, the lines ran. So help me, if you died there, they drag you out, put somebody else in, and keep the line running.
How did you handle the scrap then when you were there?
Well, we used to have, because it was reliability department, quality controls chore to add that all up and get it out of the way and ship it back if necessary, melt it or whatever had to be done. It was quality controls
Now,
problem.
the scrap, though, would that be machinery sometimes?
You mean
If not,
make a
like
mistake?
you torn out some older machinery, what do you do with older machinery? Is that
Oh,
scrap?
that was mostly scrap, but that's not the type of scrap I'm
Oh,
talking
but
about.
that would be really scrapped right out and there's.
Oh, yeah,
no
well, see,
recovery.
that stuff is depreciated, so that really didn't cost a lot,
Okay.
or General Motors or anything, when that's done, we've done that too. That wasn't the scrap I had.
Okay,
Scrap,
that's-
I'm talking about developing scrap out of, let's say you're running a piece of metal through
Sure, okay.
machinery and you make a mistake, that's scrap. Okay, and that comes up with a part that's unusable. The material would either be too expensive to make something else out of it or whatever. I mean, it's just too much involved.
Okay.
That's scrap. The shavings that you find on the floor after you machine something is scrap too. But that's,
Do you try to recover?
yeah, well, there are ways to recover it. But you see, the basic amount of money that the department, let's try to put everything in its perspective. The production people don't have anything to do with the recovery of the final recovery of that. In other words, what happens to that is of no consequence to them. It is to the corporation because it's money, okay, and money is really all out there. That's the bottom line in a corporation. But the thing that production people are concerned with is they take a piece of something at some stage of its final, somewhere along the line before it gets to its final whatever it's going to be, and they're responsible for that particular portion of whatever happens to it. In other words, say I'm making an engine block for them, and the block comes in. Well, the fellow who produced the block, the central foundry, is responsible up to that point. Then he gives it to the production people. Well, first goes to inspection, and we say, yeah, they're basically all right. I guess you can machine those and go ahead. So then it goes to production, and production has all this equipment that will drill the holes and make all the bores and do all the stuff. And then if they screw up, if they make a mistake, and that piece is scrap, they're being charged for all the labor that went into that plus that piece of steel, see, or whatever it is. In that cast iron, that's what it would be. Whatever, an alloy sometime. So now that's so many dollars. And you, as the corporate manager, know that one block is worth, say, $44. Okay? So if I make a mistake and scrap one of those, make a mistake so you can't use it anymore, that's $44 I cost you as the manager, say. So now say I do 100 of those, that's $440. And you want to know, how come? How often is this going to happen? Do I have to get somebody else to do this properly, or are you going to turn around and do it right? So, and what happens sometimes is very, very simple, and there are some ways of correcting these little things. But say, for instance, you're making a bore that's, say, basically 3 inches in diameter, and it's got a tolerance of plus or minus whatever, and you go beyond that. Well, got something you can't use unless you do something to it. Now, if you didn't go too far, possibly you can do something with it, use an oversized piston or whatever. And you can save that. Cost you a little more money because you've got to add another operation into this. But you can get away with fixing it at least. Say, for instance, you go a little bit too far, there's nothing you can do with it. You've lost that up, and so that's going to cost the company so many. But you add these things up over the period of a month, and there can be lots of them. Okay, and the reason I told you about the size there, because it's very important to this new operation. This SPC, now, don't forget, under the old system, we'd run them down and we'd get one like that and say, oh darn, let me set my tool up again. You'd set it up again and run some more, and maybe they'd be too small or maybe too big again or whatever. And you'd run into possibly the same problem down the road. However, today, first of all, we're going into SPC. We've determined that our equipment is now capable of doing what we're asking it to do because we've changed the ones that weren't. We've got all new equipment. The gauges that we designed for this with the computers that control them will tell you when you're getting close to going out of those other limits I told you about, the control limits, not the blueprint limits now, the control limits. The computer will say, uh-oh, down the road about 100 pieces, you're going to run into a problem. It's going to be either too big or too small, I can tell you right now. It isn't right now, so you better do something. So this will trigger people who will try to find out what happened or what is happening in the process. But it'll stop it before it'll make any bad pieces. So just take a look at this. Well, we used to have thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of scrap in pistons. We started this system in pistons first, and it was dramatic. We saved millions of dollars the first year on just piston scrap alone. In addition, now don't forget, the system cost us all kinds of money. They paid me as a consultant. We paid vendors to design new equipment. We bought new machinery, taught a whole bunch of people, sent them to schools with Deming and all over, bought them all kinds of books, promoted some people. I mean, all kinds of expenses involved. It still saved money on the scrap that we used to put out of that department. And plus, we used to have, say, 7 to 8 to 10 people who were responsible for taking care of the scrap as it went out. Logging in, try to figure out, maybe it's your fault, maybe it's the vendor's fault, maybe it's such an operations fault. We didn't need those people anymore. Didn't have enough scrap to happen. Maybe we have one person because you always have some things that go wrong, either a casting, the flaw or something like that. But absolutely amazing. And another thing that we did with that, we used to have 4-size pistons, 4-size bores, A, B, C, D size pistons. I don't know how familiar you are with that. Each one had a different size, and that was to allow for these differences that we were making in our machine.
Go right ahead.
Okay, where pistons and bores had to be made, or rather were made in 4 different sizes because that was the averages that used to come out, or the vagrancies of true life in the machining plant, where everything didn't come out the same size. It comes out with a hair difference. This is true of any machine part, even if they're exactly the same, and they teach you this in the Deming's courses too, that even though everything has the appearance of being exactly alike, there's some kind of a variation in it. And variation is one of the basics of this whole system, or of any system, but basically in controlling it. Naturally, you have to be very, very concerned with variation. Well, the variations that we were getting in the past, we'd have A, B, C, and D, which varied like, say, 5/10 of an inch in dimension from each other. Then beyond that, on the low side, would be too small, and beyond that, on the high side, it would be too big. So then you had other things that you had to try to figure out to do with them. But the 4 basic good ones, then you had to get pistons, which come out the same way, because it's a different process. So you're running pistons here and blocks there. Now the pistons are going to come out and try to match those other 4 sizes, just by chance. But say someday you're running all A sizes on your bores, and you're running all C sizes on your pistons. You have a heck of a deuce of a job trying to get those two together. So you have to try to do something so you can get enough production out because your sizes don't match real well. Today, with SPC, they're all one size. You don't have four sizes anymore. And that, I don't know how amazing you think that is. That is amazing. Where by chance you were trying to get four sizes, now you know you get one size. And we call it the one size piston project when we first started it, and I'll tell you what, that makes you feel good when you accomplish something like that. We were the first, incidentally, in the industry that did that. As we have been with many things at Oldsmobile. We're first. I don't know how much credit people give us for that, but we do a lot of things first. You notice we still always say we, too. But that's one of the, you take a project like that now that you're be involved in. And when you leave there in the afternoon, you keep thinking, oh, let's see, worked on this thing all day. And still, you don't have your pencil or your tools in your hand, but you still haven't given it up. Can't wait till the next morning to get back to your calculator or whatever and say, remember we were talking about that yesterday? I think what we can do, and you're off and running again. And of course, you're talking to people who have got the same engineering background that you have and want to be involved in things like that. And so you have likes. You both interested in the same subject to the extent that you're willing to talk about it, even if it's your own time. It doesn't make any difference, and breaks don't make that much difference or importance to you. So it's nice to have a job like that. It's nice to love your job. It is.
Well, George, you retired in 1980. Had you planned to retire, or did you take one of the early opportunities?
Well, I sometimes wonder why I did it, but I know that I was 62, and I felt it was time. I was working with Mike Allworth then. Did you know Mike? Did you know Mike? He was, yeah. Well, Mike,
He was at that time, what was his title?
he was assistant superintendent in the engine plant, probably one of the smartest. He was another person who didn't have an engineering degree, but the engineers would come to him about engines. When it came to engines, Mike was an expert and had been since the war. He was from England, as you probably know, and just a fine person as you'd ever want to meet. Anyway, I was his right hand, I guess, and he used. It was kind of a strange situation. I guess I decided to retire. I don't really know. Since that time, I can't really know why, because I know I'm the world's worst retiree. I just couldn't handle it. It didn't take me but 2 months after I was out of that to realize that. Fortunately, they came through and sent me to Mexico and back to the plant there and all kinds of things. So they pulled me back up out of the dumps. But why I retired at the time, maybe I just felt that 62 was time to retire. And as I retired my retirement date was August. That's the first, but with time and all this thing, get off somewhere in June. Get ready to go out. I have to tell you this story because it's real important. Mike was just beginning to get sick. Mike was a dear friend of mine as well as my superior. And his wife was an invalid, I don't know how much you know about Mike, but
No, nothing
she had
personal.
Parkinson's or one of those diseases. And so Mike had to do everything at home. He was just about my age. Mike was a little bit younger than me, months younger. And so they used to have to go out to eat a lot. We both belonged to the Elks, so we used to go to the Elks. And Marge and I didn't have any children anymore, nor did Day anymore at home. So we used to avail ourselves of the opportunity to go out with them a lot because it was difficult for him. If he stayed home, he had to do the cooking. And he had enough responsibility at the plant without doing that every night. And he liked to go out, and it wasn't easy to get a whole lot of people to go out with him because she had to go in a chair and all that. And because we were all good friends, so we used to go out quite often with him for dinner. Well, he started to get sick just before I retired, weeks before. And I mean, we're all at the age when you're in a plant like that, there's a lot of aches and pains you have that you don't have later on. Because of the floors you walk on and the stresses and things that involve your job. And so kind of first thought it was just nothing serious, but anyway, it turned out to be real serious. And at the day I retired, I started to take care of him because there was no one else to take him to the doctors, go to the hospital, and do these things. And he didn't last, but well, just a couple of months, and he died. But I was able to, fortunately, the day that I left, he left the following week. As a sick, went out sick leave, or I think just went home sick. And because he was my friend and no one else, I started to take him to the doctors and to the hospital and all these different things and make sure that they finally had him on such high doses of something that he couldn't remember what medicines to take at what time, or whether he'd take too many, what time of the day it was. And he'd say to his wife, get up in the morning at 4 o'clock, waiting by the door, and he'd say to his wife, "George is supposed to be here. It's supposed to take me to the doctor." Yeah, it's supposed to be at 9 o'clock, and it's only 4 o'clock in the morning. And he would forget all those things. And unfortunately, he was a real fine old gentleman, and he died, I believe he died in August of that year.
No, that was 1980.
That was
Yeah,
1980.
and then you mentioned, you came back as a consultant from the Senate.
Well, then we came down here, and after about 2 or 3 months, I went nuts. And they called me, we were opening a plant in Mexico.
Who called you?
It's very common, Nancy. God, I'll maybe think of this. Hey, Marge, what was the name of the fellow that Ralph's friends live across the street from, had all the kids that Dick, that was injured in the war? Sunk on a ship there in Indianapolis.
Well,
That common name.
that's
Lansing.
okay.
Anyway, I may think of it later. Anyway, he was from not labor relations, but employment.
Okay,
And he said that General Motors Assembly Division was looking for people, and that I had been recommended by the people I had worked for, and that they wanted me to go to Mexico on that project down there. Anyway,
okay, now what project was that?
we're building an engine plant in Ramos Arizpe in Saltillo, Mexico, way up in the mountains in the desert, 5,000 feet up there. Cold as the devil in the morning and nice and hot today, no humidity. No one, never had any tourists to speak of, so nobody spoke English. It was just tremendous experience. So anyway, went down there and then didn't stay as long as I had originally had hoped to. Didn't have any place to live.
Did you do down there?
Just mostly it was engaging. It was an engine plant that we were building. The assembly part of the business had already been built. And there's so many experiences inherent in something like that you could go on all day and tell you, you can't imagine. I mean, the cultures are so different. And this is like going back in time. Anyway, we were building an engine plant, and it was only half built. It was enclosed, but there's no water in there, no toilets, nothing. It was primitive, a brand new primitive building. And
What's the language barrier?
I had some knowledge of Spanish. I've got a Spanish background. Of course, I've studied other languages, so I didn't have too much of a problem with that. I hadn't spoken Spanish in 40 years, but
Okay,
I can understand it. And so it was coming back. In fact, before I left, I thought, God, not good. But some of the others didn't have it. But we were dealing with people who didn't know English, and we were dealing with technical aspects of things like gauges. And you try to talk to someone in another language, even though you can converse on a social basis possibly and get by with dinners and things like that, you try to talk to them about technical stuff when they don't understand one word of your language, not one. I mean, not one word. Even the people at the hotel wouldn't know what you were asking for if you would ask for your mail. They just didn't know any English at all. The only ones that knew any English were some of the engineers, young engineers who had been up to Detroit or Troy, where General Motors Assembly Division is. They had gone to school there for a year, or had studied under our people for a year because they were going to represent General Motors. So they understood a little, but they weren't expert linguist or anything.
How many other people in similar capacity do you live down there?
In the beginning, it was just a few of us,
4 or 5?
about 12,
Okay.
as I remember. Now, no, but we were not all from the same division. From Oldsmobile, there was just a few of us. And more, they increased that number. But Pontiac had some, Buick had some. Oh, the other divisions like Harrison Radiator, well, not on a regular basis, but the fellow who now lives in town here used to make a regular run down there. And everybody was represented, whatever they needed as far as, well, people from Tonawanda practically ran the place, so a lot of people from Tonawanda. Many who remain my good friends to this day. But anyway, they were building the same type engine in Tonawanda, which is one of the
What type of engine was
was 6-cylinder engine, the V6, which we build somewhat the same thing in Lansing right now, which was the next project. They started to call me on when we had the 4-cylinder engine going out in Plant 5 and the 6-cylinder engine going in Building 28.
How long?
So only about 3 months, but seemed no. Each year they would call me around February and ask me when I could come up. I'd only come up with warm weather, so I would come up for April, May, June, July, and August, and maybe September, and just those either 5 or 6 months. And they'd call and say, "When can you get up here?" And I'd say, "Well, gosh, you didn't give me just short notice, but I was really thinking about the cold weather."
When?
Engine plant in the gauging. I worked for Wendell Olds primarily. Thus Wendell retired later years after that, but I'd work in the engine plant, and we were working on the V6 then. This is the upgraded version of the V6 engine, which corporation's been building that V6 for many, many years. Chevrolet built it for back when we were kids, I guess. But anyway, this is an upgraded version of that. Real good engine. Matter of fact, it's in our 98s right now, and they average 32 miles to the gallon on a trip, so that's pretty good mileage for a big car loaded with people. Then we were at the same time we were building the 4-cylinder, which I didn't have that much to do with, but I'm very interested in. It's a terrific engine. Also another first. See, that's the type of engine that everybody isn't building. You once in a while see an ad for foreign handmade job, but everything that we do on a production basis. And people can't separate the wheat from the shaft. They used to talk about Mercedes builds the greatest car and the best engine. Well, Mercedes, you and I could do it ourselves if we had the time and we're going to get paid for the effort. Same thing with Mercedes. But when they build a diesel engine, each part is hand manicured. They don't build it on a production basis like we did, which is one of the sharp differences in my little story on the diesels. But anyway.
When did you stop doing consulting?
Well, when the projects were done, I never would have.
How long since you've been back on it?
Just the last 2 summers. I was up there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and 1 year the 1 year that I went down to Mexico. But I'll tell you, something like that does so much for you in a lot of ways. Ego-wise, it's just nothing can compare with what that did for me. When I first got the first call, we never did this before. General Motors didn't do it. Oldsmobile didn't do it. And after about 3 months of retirement, it's gone out of my mind. Suddenly I got this call. They asked me if I'd like to do that. And I must have gone through the ceiling. You feel 10 foot tall, and plus give you something to do and feel important. You feel like when you retire, at least I did, nobody ever asked you a question anymore. Nobody cared whether you knew anything. And my wife used to say to me, "Well, that's what retirement is. You really don't have to know anything or answer questions anymore." I said, "Well, I don't like it." So anyway, we got through that by this call. And then when they were gracious enough to call me every year, see if I could help them, mind you, which they probably needed me like a homehead, but made me feel like they did. And they would issue a purchase order and so on. And then every year they tease me about having another retirement party. They call it the 7th annual George Logan retirement party, you know, all this kind of thing. So it was really an uplift. Plus, the biggest thing was that you were able to, these things I told you about SPC and so on, and all after I retired. I mean, we were just about hearing about it. And a lot of people, particularly people that work in any kind of an environment for a long period of time, get to be our age before they retire almost, are very reluctant to make these major changes that this SPC involved. And so, and I'm different. I just don't feel like I'm getting all the changes are necessary because you have to keep up with whatever's going on in order to be a competitor. And so I was a little different from some of the old guys in that respect, that I was really interested in this thing being a success. And I knew I'd studied enough about it to know that it was worthwhile. So anyway, it's such an advantage to go back and be involved in the changes. I told you, you know, meeting people at the Young Club who retired at the same time as I did and don't know what things are going on. I didn't get like that because I was involved in the changes, fortunate enough to be back there when the changes were going on and realizing that things weren't the way they used to be.
And they aren't ever going to be, really.
And that's right.
Which is probably just as well.
Yeah, and you know, hopefully they keep progressing and that improving. And I'm sure that's the intent, so I'm sure there's people going to watch for that.
George, we've got a great interview here.
Oh, I don't know about
Yes, we do. We've got almost a couple of hours here.
that. You'll be
We
saturated.
could close this off. Do you think you covered about everything you'd like to cover?
Hey, well, I tell you, I do believe that every job that I had there fell into the same kind of category, the same kind of jobs. But it always seemed that when something good was going to come along, they just for some reason picked me for it. And I don't care who it was, whether it was Dave Odom, Tom Fleece, or who it happened to be. I'm just fortunate. I always considered myself very, very, very lucky. For instance, in between some of these jobs that I told you about here, I had a Fisher body contact job, which meant I used to check the Fisher body problems in the morning for Dave Odom and go to Fisher body during the day and try to resolve whatever was. I don't know if you remember, but Fisher body and Oldsmobile or any body plant with a car plant, car assembly plant, always have this little situation where one don't agree that it's their problem and so on and so forth. And their representative, the representative of the assembly plant, who was actually Fisher's the vendor for us, was never very well received there. And I was fortunate enough to be able to change that in large measure. They kind of got to like me, and they knew that I had a die room and tool room experience, so the engineers would allow me, and they never used to allow the representative out there before. They used to go there just to complain, see, and say, hey, fix this. And where I used to go in with engineering, we used to go out on the floor and fix the jigs and fixtures, which I was familiar with. And so they felt they had an extra help. I wasn't complaining. I was helping with the problem. And I had more friends at Fisher Body than you could shake a stick at. So, you know, it was just another one of the jobs they had there that I just loved. I was fortunate enough to hold and be able to handle it. And so I guess, I was a general supervisor in central inspection and also in plant 3 and an engine plant. And in every case, it was the same. I've enjoyed the experience. I've enjoyed the people that I've worked with and people that work for me. We like to say work with us, but just to show you that, you know, both ends of the spectrum, didn't matter whether they were over or under me or whatever, that they all, we just recently, as a matter of fact, just recently went to an Oldsmobile picnic given by the union. Myself and Rex Carter were the only 2 salaried people there that I know of. Although there was one other gentleman from engineering I didn't know, but something like that. However, all the people that were in the union gives this and puts it on. And they call me, so that one of the guys that helps put it on used to work for me. Used to be my antagonist when he was in the union. But anyway, I go up there and I meet these fellows that used to work for me at Central. Used the finest people in the world. Just, you knew all the time that
you were there, that they were terrific workers. They'd do anything in the world for you to get the job done and so on and so forth. And they even teased when we go up there. Joe will say to his wife, George doesn't ask me to get any samples out today yet, you know, or something like that. But I used to say to Marge when they come home, I said, you know, all those fellows that we meet there, every single one of those were what you might term the perfect employee. You could never, ever want for anything that they wouldn't just try to turn it out for you.
When you retired, your title was,
General supervisor.
uh,
Well, the quality control, and I usually worked in somewhere in reliability engineering department.
that was November of 1980,
That was August.
August of 1980. Okay.
And very